Hey, what's going on everyone? I'm super excited to bring you this video today. I feel like this is one of the most important videos that I've made on this channel, and that's because I feel like I made a major breakthrough trying to get the Palit RTX 3080 thermal pad replacement to work. Now, obviously, I'm not the first person to do the Palit RTX 3080 and 3090 thermal pad replacements, but it doesn't seem like there was that much information online. And so it took a lot of trial and error to get this right. Now, for anyone who's looking to do a thermal pad replacement on the 3080 or 3090 for any type of card, please make sure you watch to the end of this video so you can pick up some tips and advice from when I went to do the thermal pad replacement for this card. And for any Palit 3080, 3090 Gaming Pro owners out there, my advice is to not change out your thermal pads and only change them out if your memory junction temperatures are out of control. Alright, if you like this video, make sure to hit that like button, also to subscribe to this channel. Seems like I'm doing a lot of these GPU temperature videos, so if you like that sort of thing, hit that subscribe button. Last week I did a live stream changing out the thermal pads of the Palit RTX 3080 Gaming Pro, and as you can see in that live stream just how naive I was, thinking everything was going to go right and not really doing that much research beforehand. Yes, I had actually opened up the card and checked out the thicknesses and ordered those pads in advance of the live stream and used those pads in the live stream, but I didn't realize just how difficult it was to get it right. And so now during the week I've kept going and I finally finished the thermal pad replacement, and I think this video is going to answer a lot of questions for Palit owners. Now, I've also done an MSI RTX 3090 Ventus 3X thermal pad change, and you can see that video on my channel, and I'll leave a link in the description below. But that card was a lot easier to change out than the Palit 3080. So I think the biggest takeaway really is that with different manufacturers, you get different designs, get different heat sinks, and different thermal pad thicknesses. So make sure you get as much information as you can about your particular card, and that way you don't end up with a card that has worse temperatures than when you open it up. And also that would just create a lot of downtime for yourself trying to fix that card. Now I'll go through the thermal pad change for the Palit RTX 3080 first, and then I want to talk a little bit about the various factors that would affect anybody doing a 3080 or 3090 thermal pad change. And I want to talk a little bit about the branded thermal pads versus the unbranded thermal pads, and also the thermal conductivity that is listed in the specs for these thermal pads. And then also I want to talk about the hardness of these pads, because that's also going to determine if you can compress these thermal pads or not. So last night I finally completed the Palit 3080 thermal pad change, and it took 9 attempts. Yes, 9 attempts of opening the card and then changing out the thermal pads and closing that card and testing it. And the resulting memory junction temperature change was 0 degrees. Yes, there was no change at all from the old stock pads to the new pads, but I was actually happy about that because the other 8 attempts were way worse. The memory junction temperatures was over 100 degrees, and there are a couple of cases where it got to about 90 degrees, but the stock memory junction temperature was 84. So I was happy with 84 degrees in the end. So I'm going to walk you through each of the tests that I did. We're going to talk about why these didn't work and what actually worked in the end. Okay, the first thing I want to point out is that the stock thermal pads had a GPU core temperature of about 52 degrees and about 84 degrees on the memory junction temperature in HW Info 64. So a couple of weeks ago, I opened up the card just to double check the pad thickness to make sure I had the right pads for when I was going to do the live stream. And I found that once I opened the card, it disrupted the pads. So when I put the card back together, the temps were about 10 degrees higher. So the pads looked like they were about 1 millimeters, and I didn't have them at the time. So I decided to try out 0.5 millimeter pads anyway, as they were the only ones that I had. As you can see here in the first test, it didn't work. The GPU core temp was fine, but the memory junction temperature wasn't, so the pads were too thin and not touching the heatsink. In test 2, which was on the live stream, I tried 1mm Thermalright Odyssey pads, but now the GPU core was too hot. It was now 70 degrees and climbing. The heatsink was touching the VRAM modules, but not touching the GPU core. In the live stream, I speculated that I needed to get 0.75mm pads, which is pretty ridiculous because 0.75mm pads aren't very common. I did try to compress the pads a little to 0.9mm, but had the same issue where the GPU core was not touching the heatsink. So in the end, I found a schematic diagram online of the Palit RTX 3090 Gaming Pro, which showed that the pads did indeed need to be 0.75mm. So I ended up finding a retailer that sold 0.8mm pads, but they were fairly cheap and unbranded. In comparison, the Thermalright Odyssey pads for the same size cost $20 for a 120mm by 120mm sheet, and the unbranded one was $3 for a 100mm by 100mm sheet, but I decided to give it a shot anyway. Test 4 shows these results, and as you can see, the pads at 0.8mm wasn't touching the GPU core. At this point, it was driving me nuts and I was running out of options. In test 5, I tried using two 0.3mm pads to make 0.6mm pads. I had ordered 0.3mm pads as well, but they had adhesive on one side, so they were pretty difficult to work with, and they like to curl up at the edges. So I tried that anyway, but it was pretty obvious they were too thin. For test 6, I tried with 0.5mm unbranded pads with thermal paste in between the heatsink and thermal pads. But I found that didn't help enough, and the pads would just stick to the heatsink side. So you have to be prepared to apply thermal paste on the VRAM modules as well, which I didn't really want to do as it would make it too messy. For test 7, I got out the calipers, which I had only just bought, and measured thickness of the original pads, even though they had been out of the card for about 2 weeks by that point. They were roughly about 0.68mm, so I compressed the unbranded pads from 0.8mm to 0.68mm. I did get an improvement because now it looked like the GPU core and the thermal pads on the VRAM was touching the heatsink. The memory junction temps were in the low 90s and the GPU core temp was stable at around 50 degrees, so I considered that a half success. But I did want to do 2 more tests. For test 8, I compressed it to exactly 0.75mm to make sure that the thermal pads were touching the VRAM modules. And as you can see, I got the same result, which means you have to be exactly 0.75mm plus or minus 0.1mm when it comes to the Palit RTX 3080 Gaming Pro. And this is the problem with changing thermal pads on the Palit Gaming Pro. There is a very fine margin of error here. Finally, for test 9, I wanted to try and compress Thermalright Odyssey pads again from 1mm to 0.8mm because I speculated that the branded pads were better than the unbranded pads. It's actually quite difficult to compress the thermal pad, and I put the pad in between some non-stick plastic and used a spare heatsink I had lying around to compress the pads very evenly. So I'm pleased to report that finally did the trick, and I was able to get the GPU core and the thermal pad both touching the heatsink just right, and the memory temperatures are now back to where it was, which is where I'm going to leave this card. But I think it's important to point out that both the unbranded pad and the Thermalright Odyssey pads were rated at the same thermal conductivity of 13.8 watts per meter Kelvin. The Thermalright Odyssey pads perform better, so these pads aren't equal when it comes to performance. Gamers Nexus has once said that thermal conductivity with thermal paste were not really comparable, and that might apply for thermal pads as well.
So that's not necessarily a knock on Thermal Grizzly or Icy Diamond or anyone else. It's just a note that you shouldn't be comparing thermal conductivity between brands. You can scroll through Newegg and look at thermal conductivity on a bunch of different pastes, but ultimately it might not actually mean anything in the comparative sense. So typically it's okay to compare intra-brand, but not cross-brand, just like Fan CFM. It's best to just look at real performance in reviews like these for an idea of how it lands.
For high temperatures, it's worth it to pay a little bit more, and in some cases may require trial and error to see which brand works well. Also, the Thermalright pads have a hardness or shore value of between 30 to 55, which appears to be on the softer end, which helped me compress the pads from 1mm to 0.8mm. With thermal paste application, it doesn't hurt to use a bit more paste than usual because it may help to adjust the GPU core a little bit. I'd also recommend paste over a thermal pad like a Grizzly Carbonate because paste is malleable, and also the thermal pads are electrically conductive, and for me I didn't want to add any more risk into the process. Overall, I learned a lot from changing out the thermal pads for this Palit RTX 3080, as well as the MSI RTX 3090 Ventus 3X. And I think if your memory temperatures are out of control, if they're over 100 degrees, and you've already maxed out the fans, and you've undervolted the card, then yeah, I think it makes sense to change out your thermal pads, because I think that would do it a world of good. But if you haven't done those things yet, I would suggest doing those things first before you change out your thermal pads. And the problem with this Palit RTX 3080 is that the tolerance to get it right is down to plus or minus 0.1 millimeters. So it's a very, very fine margin of error. And if you don't get it right, then the card just doesn't work. The memory temperatures are out of control. So I think for most people, the stock thermal pads are fine. So there's no need to change them. And for owners of other 3080s and 3090s who have problems with their memory junction temperatures, make sure to get as much info as you can before you go and open up your card. Okay, that's going to be it for this one. Make sure to check out my MSI Ventus 3X thermal pad replacement video that is on my channel. And as always, if you like this video, make sure to click the like button, also to subscribe to this channel for more videos like this, and I'll see you in the next one.